Welcome to our program, Asia in Focus, Climate Justice and the Business and Human Rights Agenda. My name is Sean Lees and I work for the United Nations Development Program in Asia Pacific. Today we have a very special episode of our Asia in Focus series. Joining us in the studio are students from the International Relations and Global Affairs program at Mahidol University, Thailand. Welcome everyone. This episode of Asia in Focus is one of several in which we explore the intersection of business, climate change, and human rights. What is the role of business in addressing climate change in Asia? And who should be held accountable for any consequences to our human rights from climate change? Please be sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our future programs. Now, experts tell us that climate change will have a bigger impact on Asia than any other region. Extreme weather events and sea level rise will put the rights of millions of people at risk, including their right to health, to food, and to livelihoods. Some observers believe that policymakers and business leaders in Asia are not acting fast enough to mitigate and adapt to climate impacts. What recourse do people in Asia have? Can they rely on courts or other institutions for the answer? Can climate justice lead to concrete action where other efforts have fallen short? To help us answer these and other questions, I am joined by Matthew Baird, a founder of the Asian Research Institute on Environmental Law, and Ambassador Yuyun Wahyuningrum, Chair and Representative of Indonesia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. But before we get to our guests, we have a video clip we'd like you to see. Our team has been taking to the canals and alleyways along the Chao Phraya River here in Bangkok to talk to residents who are on the front lines of climate change. Let's hear what they have to say.
อยู่ตรงเนี้ยตั้งแต่ประมาณอายุ15 16ประมาณนี้รู้สึกว่ามันจะสูงเร็วขึ้นกว่าปกติอะไรเงี้ยแล้วก็แบบระยะเวลาในการลดลงของมันใช้เวลานานแล้วก็ขังเร็วขึ้นระดับน้ำคือเวลาขึ้นมันขึ้นเร็วแต่กว่ามันจะลดลงนะคะมันใช้เวลานานผลกระทบเยอะอยู่พอสมควรคือชีวิตประจำวันเราที่เราต้องแบบใช้ชีวิตอยู่ตรงนี้อย่างเงี้ยค่ะมันก็แบบเดินลำบากใช้ชีวิตลำบากบางทีแบบต้องลุยน้ำที่ขาค่ะมันจะเป็นแผลแบบเน่าจากน้ำกัดอย่างเงี้ยค่ะคันแล้วก็คือมันจะหายได้ยากเพราะว่าเราต้องลุยน้ำอยู่ทุกวันอย่างเงี้ยค่ะคือเราอยู่ริมน้ำปัญหามันก็ต้องแบบเกิดขึ้นทุกปีนะคะแล้วเพราะถ้ามันหนักขึ้นเรื่อยๆอย่างเงี้ยค่ะมันก็อยู่ลำบากอะค่ะเพราะว่าให้เราย้ายที่อยู่มันก็ยากใช่ไหมคะก็ต้องพยายามอยู่ให้ได้แต่ถ้าแบบเขามาแก้ไขให้เราก็อาจจะอยู่แบบง่ายขึ้นอย่างเงี้ยค่ะ
ใช่มันเพิ่มขึ้นทุกปีและปีนี้เยอะมากแล้วมันก็จะไหลเข้าบ้านป้าอย่างตรงนั้นน่ะพอมันล้นปุ๊บมันก็จะเทลงไปทางบ้านป้าพอดีเพราะว่าบ้านป้าเตี้ยแต่ถ้าไม่มีกระสอบทรายนี่มันก็คือเข้าทางนี้ไหลไปหมดเลยก็กลัวว่าถ้าเกิดน้ำมันเข้าไปกระทันหันน่ะป้ามีคนแก่ป้าก็กลัวว่าน้ำเข้าแล้วเราออกไม่ทันเรากลัวไฟดูดถ้าปีนี้น้ำท่วมอีกเราก็ลำบากอนาคตมันก็ต้องเพิ่มขึ้นเราก็ต้องเดือดร้อนมากขึ้นใช่ไหมแต่เราก็ไม่สามารถจะเปลี่ยนแปลงบ้านเราได้เพราะเราไม่ได้มีเงินเราก็ต้องรับสภาพแต่เวลาเราขออะไรไปก็ขอให้มาไวหน่อยเพื่อให้ทันกับเราเพราะบ้านเราเตี้ยถ้าไม่ทันน้ำเข้าบ้านเราคนแก่เด็กเราไม่ไหวเราช่วยไม่ทันแล้วถ้ามากลางคืนยิ่งเดือดร้อนเลยเพราะน้ำขึ้นอีกรอบนึงชอบขึ้นตอนกลางคืนเรากลัวไง
Matthew, from the video clip, you can clearly see that climate change is having an impact on people living in low-lying areas of Thailand. Tell us, what kind of remedies do people living along the Chao Phraya have with regards to these big impacts, these big changes happening in their lives?
Thanks, Sean. And I think, tragically, very little. There's very little remedies that are actually available for people like that because we are seeing those impacts of climate change and the predictions of those continuing impacts of climate change. So unless we take action with those communities now, It's going to get worse for the next 50 years, and that means saltwater intrusion, that means flooding. But in northern Thailand, it means droughts. In the Philippines, it means greater storm events, typhoons. Those sort of impacts that we see there are going to be replicated throughout our ASEAN community. And so what we need when we're talking about remedies is we have to think of action. We have to take action to protect those human rights and the people who are most vulnerable but are continuing to be vulnerable. And those actions mean government have to get together with the business sector. And first of all, we have to stop greenhouse gas emissions. We have to do everything we can to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And then we have to adapt. We have to get ready for what is going to happen, what the scientists are telling is going to happen. And we've seen that in the video.
In terms of action, I've been hearing a lot about climate justice as being a form of action that communities like this should be taking or should be leveraging for these remedies, for whatever action is required, for further action, if you will. Tell us, what does climate justice mean? What is your definition of climate justice?
So climate justice is a new concept, and probably because our traditional mechanisms have failed. But what climate justice tries to do is it tries to bring in this moral, this ethical and this social dimension so that it's not just an environmental issue or an economic issue. It puts the rights and human rights and justice rights of those communities, those vulnerable communities, right at the centre of action. And that's where I think climate justice is really, really powerful, especially as we approach what is going to be a really significant challenge over the next decade to take action on climate change.
So it's taking questions like around climate processes, what's impacting our atmosphere, why is our planet warming? It's taking that conversation out of scientific circles, our high-level policy circles, and putting them in the hands of people that we saw in the video clip.
That's right. And so the science is certain. There is no more greater scientific certainty than human anthropogenic causes of climate change are causing significant changes to our planet. And the tragedy is it's going to be both droughts, and we've seen that in northern Thailand and the Mekong area, as well as floods, as well as increasing sea level rises. So all of those things are happening at once, and we call that sort of that wicked problem. So how can policymakers react? Well, they can put economic and say, well, it's going to cost a lot, so we can't take action. Politicians can say, well, I've got to provide a job for my constituents. But climate justice says, no, we have to look at the next 20 years, the next 30 years now. It's saying there's an ethical and moral obligation to save the planet and to act. And that's why it's really important.
Are businesses changing behavior now in light of litigation or the threat of litigation that might be coming down the line?
So that's the challenge. And perhaps it's a challenge also within our communities that businesses are still saying it costs something to be sustainable. I was recently at the Economist Sustainability Week Asia, and we were talking about bringing these sustainability issues, climate issues, before boards, before directors, before companies. And even then the chief sustainability officers were saying it's a challenge because it does cost something to respond to climate change, to mitigate, to adapt, to provide money to support those communities. And they still have to persuade the board that's looking in those 3-year cycles. Well, we're looking 50 years out. We're looking at what's going to happen in 50 years. The scientists have said what's going to happen clearly. And so it's still that challenge. We still haven't got there to persuade companies to really move on climate change and biodiversity loss.
So we're not seeing an immediate effect, but things are in motion. Is that yes or no? Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes, they are.
Ambassador, you are the chairperson and representative for Indonesia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. And you have been working on cementing that link between climate and human rights for some time now, maybe almost 10 years. What is the progress so far on that, and what's that journey been like?
So ICHR has been observing the situation in the region, and what happened in the video just now we saw happened also in different countries, and require responses from different countries and require regional concerns. The climate change has been included as a regional concern in the previous summits, which require regional responses. And ICHR has been consulting with different stakeholders, also ASEAN member states, in the need of perceiving climate change from the perspective of human rights. Unfortunately, member states have different perspective, different approaches to see environment and climate change. So ICHR had been bringing together since 2015, putting together some issues. So for instance, how to see climate change with business and human rights, climate change and trafficking person, gender lens from to the climate change, and many others. The impact of climate change to children. So we have been bringing these stakeholders from one issue to another, and now we are arrived at the development of the ASEAN framework to the environmental rights. We hope that the existing situation, the current discussion, and the knowledge produced by the series of consultation will bring some ideas, inspiration, action oriented framework for member states in this framework on environmental rights. But having said this, I also would like to recognize that ASEAN come up with number of declaration and statement on environment, not necessarily on human rights, and that is why this is the contribution of ICHR to add the lens, to add the perspective of human rights into the situation that we are facing now.
Yeah, and you made mention of the regional environmental framework that you're currently working on. It does sound like progress, and indeed the work of ICHR is important, and it does feel like progress. But how will this framework in particular, but also the rest of your work, make a difference in the lives of the people? The video clip that we just saw.
Certainly, it is not a silver bullet, but this is something perhaps giving the clear roles for member states, because using framework of human rights means we define and clarify the role of the states as duty bearer and the right of holders. What should be protected, what should be fulfilled, and what should be promoted and respected as the human rights of individual and collective in relation to environment. So this framework may contribute to what states should fulfill, the
States
obligation.
Member states of ASEAN.
Member states.
I see.
Of member states to respect, protect, fulfill human rights of individual and groups, and also to inform public these are your rights, and knowing their rights, people can demand these rights.
And why is this important in your home country, Indonesia?
Watching the video here on Chao Phraya River actually remind me on situation in Indonesia. I attended the photo exhibition in which a photographer put the situation before and after. So she documented very well that some villages in Central Java, in West Java, in different parts of Indonesia had been disappeared.
Disappeared.
Yes, but the photographer also show us the disappeared is not only the land or the house or the properties, but also the culture, the identity, the home where the people belong to that area.
So the impact's on a village, it's on farmland, but it's also on the culture, and with devastating impacts for today's youth, but also future generations. Yeah. Well, let's see now if there's any questions from the audience. Please.
Hi, my name is Isabel, and my question to you, Mr. Matthew, is that a lot of people in my generation fear that time is running out and that we will suffer worse consequences of climate change than our parents and grandparents. So what I want to know is, what can the youth do to demand climate action? Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. And my response is everything, because I think the youth are the ones that are going to make the difference. When we talk about decisions that are being made, it's about your life and your future, because the decisions we take now are the things that are going to be important in 2050. So what I would say is for young people, get engaged. Ask your politicians where they stand. What are they going to do? Not what are they going to say about climate change. What are they going to do? Talk to friends, talk to family, talk to TikTok influencers, talk to people on Instagram. Every message any idea, any way of saying what are you going to do to resolve and tackle the issue of climate change. That, I think, is the most important thing we can do, is action now, because it is going to be your life. These impacts are going to really, really impact on you over the next 30 to 50 years. And that's why it really matters that your voice is heard and that actions reflect what you need and the things that can be done. So get engaged, get involved in any way possible.
Great question, Isabel. Let's see if there's any other questions. Please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Alisla Sengsampong, student from International Relations and Global Affairs Program from Munich. I would like to ask Ambassador Yuyun on the question, how can we hold ASEAN member countries, including Indonesia, under accountable to the contributions on climate change issue, and how can we ensure that they are doing their parts to mitigate the environmental impacts of their operations? Thank you.
Thank you for that important question. It's very timely to ask that question now. Perhaps this is the time for us to see and to develop, to design, or to think beyond, out of the box on how we can file the complaints to the court by equipping the court with the power to be able to make decision, as well as to ensure that the decision of the court can be implemented both by companies as well as by governments to ensure accountability. With the ASEAN framework on the environmental rights, we would like to see this accountability mechanism to be discussed, how the regional accountability mechanism can complement the national mechanism to seek accountability. So we hope we can discuss that, but we already receive a lot of demand from young people to include accountability mechanism in the ASEAN framework on environmental rights.
Well, thank you very much for that question, Ploy. Any other questions? We have time for one more. Please.
Hi, my name is Boa, and I'd like to ask Mr. Matthew, how can we practically enhance transnational climate litigation, because there are lots of international environmental law in place, but many states and corporations still feel like they don't have any legal obligation or responsibility to carry out remedy or to take an action to protect environment, despite the fact that climate change is affecting the population in their countries and beyond.
Thanks, Bo. And as a lawyer, I always think that litigation and making companies, as well as countries, liable and responsible for their actions or their lack of actions is really important. I think these days, one of the advantages that we can do is that we can communicate, and I think the recent work of the Pacific climate students, working with climate students from the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and that led into this sort of global network to actually bring before the United Nations the idea of this resolution looking at the obligations of states for action on climate change. And I think, as I've mentioned before, we've had some litigation on companies and their decisions. So the opportunity of students maybe within Southeast Asia to link up with environmental defenders offices in Australia, for example, looking at the obligations of transnational corporations and how the actions, using the courts in Australia perhaps, or Singapore, or America, or England, or Europe, we can start to make sure that these decisions taken by companies, transnational companies in our countries in the region, are made liable in the courts. And I think that's the advantage that we can do. We can link up with other activists, other students, other people, trying to sort of say, make the decisions now for us. And that's the advantage that we can do. Working together, taking on these global actions, maybe commencing actions in a number of jurisdictions against a company that is causing climate change or environmental destruction of mangroves or forests that are big carbon sinks or affecting the oceans. And this is where what students can do, what young people can do now is unlimited. And it's only a question of enforcing those rights that you have and that have been identified also by AICHA as well.
Thank you all for the questions today, and to our guests. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here to discuss this very important issue of climate justice and the business and human rights agenda. In our next episode of Climate Justice, we're going to talk to attorney Roberto Cadiz, president of the Climate Action and Human Rights Institute and former commissioner of the Philippines Commission on Human Rights. We'll also speak to lawyer and rights activist Sor Ratnamani Pokla to discuss her role in the climate justice movement and much more. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss the next episode of Asian Focus. Bye for now.